I lived a crime story for 30 days. A terrifying journey into the unknown. The first step into darkness. It all began on a dull Wednesday afternoon. I had just wrapped up a monotonous day at the office when I stumbled upon an unusual challenge online. Live a crime story for 30 days, and record your experience. No rules, no limits, just survival. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the adrenaline rush I sought, or maybe, deep down, I wanted to feel alive. Either way, I clicked enter, and from that moment my life changed forever. I thought it was a joke at first, maybe a quirky social experiment. The challenge's website was crude and bare, with minimal details. Just an address and a date to show up. Felt too strange to be real. But curiosity gnawed at me, and I figured, what's the worst that could happen? So, on the appointed day, I packed a few essentials, left behind the comfort of my apartment, and drove out to the location. The address led me to an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of rats scurrying through the trash. A thick, musty smell hung in the air, making me nauseous. This was where I'd be living for the next 30 days, or so I thought. Just as I was about to turn around and reconsider the whole idea, a man stepped out of the shadows. His face was obscured by a hood, and the only thing visible were his cold, calculating eyes. "You're here for the challenge?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I hesitated for a moment but nodded. "Yes, I am." He handed me a sealed envelope, his hand trembling slightly. "You start now. Open this once you're inside. And remember, there's no turning back." My stomach churned, but I took the envelope, nodded, and headed toward the warehouse door. The second I crossed the threshold, it felt like the air itself grew heavier. I opened the envelope, my hands shaking as I pulled out a single sheet of paper. The instructions were simple, yet chilling. Your crime story begins. Survive the next 30 days. You are now being watched. I looked around, my skin prickling at the thought of hidden cameras recording my every move. For a moment I considered leaving. But something kept me there. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps the thrill of the unknown. It wasn't until night fell that the true weight of the situation hit me. As the warehouse plunged into darkness, I heard the first sound, a faint scraping like metal against concrete. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was nothing visible. The scraping continued, growing louder, coming closer. I clutched the tiny flashlight I had packed, its weak beam barely cutting through the blackness. Then I saw it, a shadow darting in the far corner. I swung the light toward it, but nothing was there. Just emptiness. The noise stopped, leaving me in suffocating silence. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. What had I gotten myself into? I spent the entire night sitting in a corner, my back pressed against the cold concrete wall, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When dawn finally broke, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The first night was over, but I knew it was just the beginning. A stranger in the shadows. The next day the warehouse seemed different. In the daylight, it appeared almost mundane. An ordinary dilapidated building, forgotten by time. But I knew better now. The envelope's instructions hadn't lied. I was being watched. The creeping paranoia set in fast. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside felt like a threat. I explored the warehouse, looking for any sign of life or hidden cameras, but found nothing except decaying furniture and rusted machinery. The only unsettling thing I noticed was a door at the far end of the building that I hadn't seen the night before. It was small, almost too easy to miss, and looked like it led to a basement or hidden room. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at it, debating whether or not to open it. I approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusted handle. But before I could turn it, a voice from behind startled me. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I spun around, my heart pounding. A figure stood in the shadows, a man dressed in all black, his face partially hidden by a hood. He stepped forward, and I recognized him as the same man who had handed me the envelope the day before. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Some doors are better left closed," he replied cryptically. You don't want to know what's on the other side. I stared at him, my mind racing. Was he trying to protect me, or was this another part of the twisted game? Before I could ask, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, confused and terrified. The door loomed before me, beckoning me to open it. But I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My gut told me to leave it alone, but my curiosity was almost unbearable. I needed answers. As I stood there, torn between fear and curiosity, I heard something behind the door. A faint tapping sound like someone or something was knocking from the other side. The basement below. The tapping grew louder, and with it, so did the pounding of my heart. Each knock sent a jolt of dread through my body, urging me to flee. But something darker, something insidious, kept me frozen in place. It wasn't just fear. It was a desperate need to know what lay beyond that door. My hand hovered over the handle again, this time gripping it tightly. The cold metal felt unnervingly real, like the weight of the situation itself. With a deep breath, I twisted it, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into pitch-black darkness. The air from below was thick and musty, carrying a foul stench that made me gag. The darkness seemed alive, swallowing the faint light from the warehouse behind me. I hesitated on the first step, but the tapping sound had stopped. Silence. My instincts screamed to retreat, but the lure of whatever mystery lurked below pulled me in. Step by step, I descended into the unknown. Each creak of the old wooden stairs sounded louder in the suffocating quiet. The further I went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The basement was deeper than I expected, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment. I reached the bottom and flicked on my flashlight. The beam was weak, barely piercing the shadows around me. The room was small and bare, with nothing but a single old wooden chair sitting in the middle. On the floor around the chair, scratches were etched into the concrete, long, jagged marks that looked like they had been made by something, or someone desperately trying to escape. The sight of the scratches sent a chill down my spine. I swept my light around the room, searching for any other sign of life, but the basement was completely empty. I stood there, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, when suddenly I heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was louder, echoing from the walls around me. Panicked, I turned toward the staircase, ready to run, but as I took a step, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and the sudden darkness enveloped me completely. I screamed, banging my fists against the walls, desperately trying to find my way back up. But the tapping continued, relentless, as if it were inside my head now. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to make it work, but it flickered weakly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. Something or someone was down here with me. I froze, straining to hear over the tapping, which was now a maddening rhythm in my ears. But then I heard another sound, something worse, breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, my hands shaking violently. In the far corner of the room I saw it, a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me, barely visible in the faint light. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Was it human? Or had I stumbled into something far worse? The figure shifted, its movements unnatural and slow, like it was struggling to rise. My heart raced, panic gripping me tighter as I took a step back. The scratching on the floor, the closed door, the tapping, it all made sense now. Whoever or whatever this was, they had been trapped down here. And now I was too. The figure turned toward me, and the flashlight flickered again. For a split second I saw its face, sunken eyes, gaunt cheeks, and a mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The sight sent a wave of terror crashing over me, and I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Everything plunged into darkness. I could feel the presence moving toward me, the heavy breathing closer now. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of pure, primal fear. Suddenly the breathing stopped. The tapping had ceased too. The silence was even worse. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the cold sweat trickling down my back. I scrambled to find the flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I groped in the darkness. When my fingers finally wrapped around it, I clicked it back on. The light illuminated the room, and to my horror, the figure was gone. I gasped, spinning around, searching for any sign of it. But the room was empty. No scratches, no breathing, no figure. Just the chair, the marks on the floor, and the suffocating darkness pressing in on me. And then, out of nowhere, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open again. Without thinking, I bolted for the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door and into the warehouse, slamming it shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the door, terrified that the figure might follow me. But nothing happened. The warehouse was eerily silent, just as it had been before. I glanced around, half expecting to see the hooded man from earlier, but the place was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands were still trembling as I leaned against the cold concrete wall, struggling to process what I had just experienced. Was it real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? Whatever this crime story was, I was in deeper than I had imagined. And I still had 29 days to go. An unsettling message. I stood there, my back pressed against the cold wall, trying to steady my breathing. The faint hum of the warehouse filled the silence, but every creak and groan of the building had me on edge. What was this challenge? Was it a test, a game, or something far more sinister? I had no answers, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to move again. My legs wobbled as I pushed off the wall, my mind still reeling from the encounter in the basement. I needed to know if that figure had been real or just a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But part of me didn't want to find out. I turned to leave the warehouse, hoping to get some fresh air, but as I approached the main entrance, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, pinned to the door, was a new envelope, identical to the one I had received on the first day. My heart sank. It hadn't been there before. With shaking hands, I pulled the envelope off the door and tore it open. Inside was another note, written in the same neat, eerie handwriting. Day 2, you're not alone. Keep moving. Time is running out. My skin crawled at the words, and I scanned the empty warehouse, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The note seemed more like a threat than advice. Someone was watching me, tracking my every move, and they wanted me to know it. The thought sent a wave of paranoia through me. Was there a camera hidden somewhere, recording everything? Or worse, was someone physically in the building, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? I crumpled the note in my hand, my mind racing. Keep moving, it had said. But where? There was nowhere else to go inside the warehouse, and I wasn't about to head back down to that basement. I decided to leave, to escape this place and regroup. But as I reached for the door handle, I felt it. Something cold brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The warehouse was as empty and silent as before. I rubbed the back of my neck, trying to convince myself it was just a draft or my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had to get out of there. As I pulled the door open and stepped outside, the midday sun blinded me momentarily, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the warehouse. I took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to shake off the lingering terror. The world outside felt oddly normal, like none of the horrors I had just experienced could touch me here. But I knew better now. The game, whatever it was, had already begun, and I was trapped in it. I glanced back at the warehouse, its decaying structure looming like a forgotten relic. The place seemed so ordinary from the outside, but I knew it was anything but. I needed to figure out what I had gotten myself into, and fast. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me back to reality. I pulled it out, hoping for some kind of message or instruction, but it wasn't from the challenge. It was from an unknown number, the message short and cryptic. Don't trust the shadows. They lie. I stared at the message, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. Shadows. What did that mean? The figure in the basement. Or was it something else? And who had sent this message? Was it part of the game, or was someone trying to help me? Before I could think any further, another message popped up. If you want answers, follow the light. Follow the light. What light? I glanced around, scanning the empty lot surrounding the warehouse, but there was nothing unusual in sight. The messages were making less and less sense, and the paranoia was creeping back in. I had the distinct feeling I was being toyed with, like a puppet in someone's twisted game. But I couldn't stop now. I needed to see this through. I started walking, heading away from the warehouse, hoping to find some clarity. But as I made my way down the dirt road leading back to my car, I noticed something strange. The light was changing. The bright midday sun seemed to dim unnaturally, and shadows stretched longer, darker, as if the day was ending far too early. A low rumble in the distance made me pause. Thunder. There hadn't been any forecast for a storm today. I looked up at the sky, and sure enough, dark clouds were beginning to gather, swirling in a way that made my stomach twist in knots. Something was coming, something unnatural. My phone buzzed again. It's closer than you think. I looked around frantically, heart pounding in my chest. Closer. What was closer? The shadows seemed to shift around me, taking on eerie shapes. Panic surged through me as I started to run, my feet pounding against the dirt road. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running from, but every instinct in me screamed to get away. But the shadows followed. They seemed to grow, crawling across the ground, moving unnaturally fast. No matter how far I ran, they were always right behind me, just out of reach. I could hear them now, a faint whispering like voices carried on the wind. I glanced back just for a second, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, obscured by the growing darkness. It was the same figure from the basement, the same twisted face and sunken eyes. It didn't move, didn't chase, but it watched. And somehow that was worse. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The world around me grew darker, more distorted, as if reality itself was unraveling. But then, through the suffocating darkness, I saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. The message had said to follow the light. It was my only hope. Without hesitation, I veered toward it, running as fast as my legs could carry me. The shadows were closing in, the figure growing nearer, but I pushed on. The light grew brighter, cutting through the darkness, and with one final burst of energy, I reached it. It was a lantern, hanging from a tree branch, flickering softly in the encroaching storm. I collapsed beneath it, gasping for air, and as the light washed over me, the shadows retreated, disappearing into the distance. For the moment I was safe. But deep down I knew this was just the beginning. The lantern's secret. The lantern flickered above me, its light weak but steady. I leaned against the tree, trying to calm my ragged breathing. The weight of the last few minutes hung heavy in the air. Those shadows, that figure, and the overwhelming sense that something far more sinister was lurking in the distance. For now, the light kept the darkness at bay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my safety was temporary. I stood up, trying to gather my thoughts. Why a lantern? And why here? My phone buzzed again in my pocket. With trembling hands, I pulled it out, bracing myself for another cryptic message. This time it was different. There was an address. 310 Thorn Street. Time is slipping. Move fast. I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Thorn Street was a few miles away, closer to the city. What was waiting for me there? And why did I feel like I was running out of time? The light of the lantern wavered again, dimming slightly. I looked around, realizing I couldn't stay in this spot forever. Whatever was following me hadn't given up. It was just waiting for the right moment to strike. I checked my surroundings, heart racing as I realized how alone I was. The road ahead stretched on, empty and silent, and my car was parked farther back, closer to the warehouse. I needed to get to Thorn Street, and fast. With renewed urgency, I jogged back toward my car. Every step felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves were trying to pull me back. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted figure from the basement materializing out of the darkness. But the road behind me remained empty. Finally, I reached my car. I threw open the door, jumped in, and started the engine. The roar of the motor was comforting, grounding me in the real world for just a moment. I pulled out of the dirt road, tires kicking up dust, and sped toward Thorn Street. The sun had dipped lower now, casting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. The eerie sense of foreboding hung thick in the air. The shadows that had once stalked me from the warehouse seemed to follow, clinging to the edge of my vision, never fully revealing themselves but always present. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into something far worse than what I'd already encountered. The messages, the shadows, the figure, it was all building up to something, and I was about to plunge headfirst into it. After what felt like an eternity, I pulled up in front of 310 Thorn Street. It was an old, dilapidated building, seemingly abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. There was no sign of life, no light, nothing to indicate why I was supposed to be here. I parked the car, hesitating for a moment as I stared at the building. It looked like something out of a nightmare. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. I had to know what was inside. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and approached the building. The closer I got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air seemed thicker here, the silence heavier. I reached the front door and pushed it open. It creaked loudly, echoing through the empty interior. I stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The place was a wreck, debris scattered across the floor, furniture overturned, walls crumbling. The faint smell of decay hung in the air. I took a few cautious steps, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, half expecting another cryptic message. But this time it was a picture. I froze as I stared at the screen. It was a photo of me, standing in the very room I was in right now. The picture had been taken from the far corner of the room. My blood ran cold as I realized someone had been watching me. Someone was still watching me. I spun around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but the room appeared empty. My breathing quickened as paranoia gripped me again. I took a few steps toward the spot where the photo had been taken, my hand gripping my phone like a lifeline. As I neared the corner, I noticed something strange. A faint glow, barely visible, seeping out from beneath a large wooden crate. I crouched down, hesitating for a moment before lifting the crate. Beneath it, buried under a layer of dust and debris, was a small metal box. It looked old, the surface scratched and dented, but the glow was unmistakable. It was coming from inside. I gingerly picked up the box, my hands trembling. There was a small latch on the side, rusted with age. I hesitated for a moment before flipping it open. The lid creaked as I lifted it, revealing the source of the glow. Inside was a phone identical to mine, but with one crucial difference. Its screen was cracked, and the message on it was chilling. "Welcome to day 3. The glow from the screen illuminated a second object in the box, a folded piece of paper. With shaky hands, I pulled it out and unfolded it. The message was scrawled in the same eerie handwriting as the previous notes. "This is only the beginning. You have 27 days left." I dropped the paper, my heart racing. The reality of my situation hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just some game or random prank. Whoever or whatever was behind this was playing with me, guiding me through some twisted nightmare. And I was completely at their mercy. As I stood there, the shadows in the room seemed to shift again, closing in around me. Had to get out. I grabbed the metal box, stuffed the phone and paper back inside, and bolted for the door. But as I reached the entrance, something stopped me in my tracks. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light outside. It was the same figure from the basement, the same twisted smile, the same sunken eyes. It took a step toward me, and I stumbled back, my mind screaming in terror. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring my fear. I was trapped, caught between the shadows of the room and the figure blocking my only escape. And then it spoke, its voice low and distorted. "You're running out of time." My body went cold, and before I could react, the figure lunged toward me. The world spun as I felt myself falling, my vision blurring as everything went black. The maze of deception. When I woke up, I was no longer in the house on Thorn Street. The familiar dilapidated walls, the suffocating shadows, and the twisted figure from the doorway were all gone. Instead, I found myself lying on cold, damp ground. My head throbbed, and a faint ringing filled my ears. As I blinked away the blur from my vision, the reality of where I was began to settle in. I was in some kind of maze. The walls were tall and constructed of what looked like rough stone, their surfaces slick with moisture. Overhead, the sky was dark, swirling with thick, ominous clouds. The air was damp and cold, heavy with the smell of mildew. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, just a deep, eerie silence. I pushed myself up, groaning from the dull pain coursing through my body. My memory was fuzzy, but I remembered the figure lunging at me, the fear that had paralyzed me, and then nothing. How had I ended up here? And where was here, exactly? I stood up, glancing around. The narrow passage stretched endlessly in two directions, disappearing into the gloom. There was no way to tell which way led to safety or danger. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Whoever had brought me here was still in control, manipulating every move I made. I pulled out my phone, hoping for some clue or message, but the screen was black. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but nothing happened. The battery was dead. I cursed under my breath, shoving the useless device back into my pocket. As I stood there, trying to decide which direction to take, a low rumble echoed through the maze. At first, it was distant, like thunder rolling across the sky. But then it grew louder, more insistent, reverberating off the stone walls. It wasn't thunder. It was something moving, something large. Panic surged through me. I needed to move, and fast. I took off, running down the passageway to my left, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The maze twisted and turned unpredictably, each corner revealing more endless stone walls. Every now and then I would stop, listening for the sound of movement behind me. It was always there, closer now, like it was hunting me. The passage opened into a wider area, and in the dim light, I could make out a large, rusted metal door set into one of the walls. It was the first sign of something other than stone, and without hesitation, I sprinted toward it. My hands trembled as I gripped the cold, rusted handle, yanking it with all my strength. It didn't budge. Frustrated, I pounded on the door, hoping against hope that someone would hear me. But the maze swallowed the sound, leaving nothing but the distant rumbling behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, when I noticed something strange on the ground at my feet. It was small and looked ancient, its surface worn and tarnished. My heart raced as I picked it up, praying it was the key to the door. With shaking hands, I inserted it into the lock and turned. There was a soft click, and the door swung open. Without a second thought, I stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The rumbling outside grew louder, then faded as if whatever was chasing me had passed by. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes and trying to steady my breathing. For the moment I was safe. But as I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't alone. The room was small and dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the far corner, a figure sat hunched over, their back to me. The air in the room was thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. I took a cautious step forward, my pulse quickening. Something about the way the figure sat, so still, so silent, made me uneasy. I wanted to leave, but I knew I needed answers. I needed to know what was going on. "Who are you?" I asked, taking another step toward them. Slowly the figure turned. My stomach dropped as I saw their face. It was the same twisted, sunken-eyed figure from the basement and Thorn Street. The grotesque smile was still there, stretched unnaturally across their gaunt face. But now, up close, I could see the truth. This wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, its features grotesquely painted to resemble the figure I had encountered before. I stumbled back, horrified, my mind racing. What was this? Why would someone leave a mannequin here, dressed to look like the figure that had been haunting me? Before I could process it any further, my phone buzzed. My heart nearly stopped. The battery had been dead. How was it working now? I pulled it from my pocket and stared at the screen. A new message had appeared. You're getting closer, but so is the darkness. My blood ran cold as I realized what it meant. The maze, the mannequin, the chase. They were all part of a larger game, a game that was far from over. I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling trapped. The door I had entered through was still shut, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was chasing me was relentless, and the maze was unforgiving. The mannequin's blank, staring eyes seemed to follow me as I moved toward the other side of the room. There, hidden in the shadows, was another door. It was smaller than the first, made of heavy wood with intricate carvings etched into its surface. Unlike the first door, this one didn't have a keyhole. I hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. My instincts screamed at me not to open it, that whatever lay beyond was far worse than anything I'd encountered so far. But I had no choice. Staying here meant certain death. With a deep breath, I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. A blast of cold air hit me, and I stepped through into darkness once more. The voices in the dark. The door closed behind me with a thud, plunging me into complete darkness. The chill in the air was bone deep, and the silence was suffocating. There was no light, no sense of direction, just an endless, oppressive void. I fumbled for my phone, hoping it would still work, but the screen remained dark, unresponsive. I took a step forward, arms outstretched, trying to feel my way through the darkness. My footsteps echoed eerily, as if the space around me were impossibly large. Every sound seemed amplified, each step louder than the last. And then I heard it, a whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought I had imagined it. But then it grew louder, more distinct. Voices, multiple voices, whispering in the dark. They were speaking too low for me to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. They were mocking me, taunting me, feeding off my fear. My pulse quickened as I tried to pinpoint where the voices were coming from, but they seemed to surround me, coming from every direction at once. I turned in circles, disoriented, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were closing in on me. Suddenly, I felt something brush against my arm. I froze, terror gripping me as the whispers intensified. Louder now, almost deafening. I stumbled backward, my back hitting something solid.